afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. This talk will explore the reasons that the founding of the first province of Dominicans in the United States was accomplished by members of the English province and not the Irish province, as one would expect. England and the United States had been at war from 1776 till 1781, and tensions still existed between the countries in the early 1800s as the British Navy was impressing sailors into their navy. Another war would commence between the two countries in 1812. What circumstances led members of the English province to come to the United States and found another province? At the time, Ireland seemed to be the logical place from which Dominicans would be attracted in this endeavor. An Irish socius, who was like an assistant to the Master General, is in Rome at the time, Father Luke Concannon. We'll talk about him later. He would prove to be very supportive of the new province. Already there were several Irish Dominicans in the United States after the Revolutionary War, serving as missionaries under Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, and eventually Bishop Fenwick in Boston. These men did not propose founding a new province, nor did they join it when it was founded. And my talk today seeks to explore this kind of puzzle. I want to start by talking a little bit about the origins of the order. We started 800 years ago. In the early 1200s, an Augustinian canon from Spain was traveling with his bishop to the Netherlands to arrange a marriage for the royal family in Spain. In traveling through southern France, both men noticed the prevalence of a new form of heresy. It was called Manichaeanism, called Albigensianism, because one of the hotbeds of Albigensianism was in Toulouse and in Albi, which are in southwestern France. It was an extreme form of Plato's philosophy, which basically emphasized the idea or the ideal to the detriment of physical things. Plato taught that physical things were imperfect. They were corruptible. As soon as something took shape, a physical shape, it was beginning almost to fall apart, and would fall apart eventually. It was finite. It'd have a beginning and an end, and therefore not nearly as important as your ideas of these things. The Albigensians took this further and thought that physical things were not just not important, but that they were evil. That physical things right across the board were evil. This meant artwork, music, entertainment, even physical love. They were against marriage because it might bring new life into the world. And what they wanted to do was to get out of this world. They encouraged suicide. So you can see what they're up against in this. And they had 4 bishops who were Albigensian bishops. So there's a problem. It's a very popular thing, especially among noble women. And so Dominic, they kind of tarry in France and begin preaching against this heresy. It has repercussions in religion as well, because if physical things are evil, Christ could not possibly be God, nor could the sacraments possibly be productive of divine effects. So Dominic will begin preaching and insisting on the goodness of God's creation. He quickly saw the need for a new form of religious life, which we call the friars, which would be mobile. That was going to be a big one. The ability to move from one diocese to another and still remain in so you're not staying in a monastery and taking a vow of stability, and you're not in the countryside. You're going to be in cities where universities are springing up, where the population centers are growing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so he wants to form this order, and he gets approval in 1216, exactly 800 years ago, to begin this, along with St. Francis, who will be doing something a little different, but his group is going to be called friars as well. He first establishes a house for women, Albigensians who were converting back to Catholicism, who were celibate, and they were still full of religious fervor. How can we channel this in a positive way rather than have them remain as Albigensians? So he forms a house in Pruy in southern France. And the dog here is our symbol. And it's an interesting symbol because it's supposedly his mother had a dream when she was pregnant with him of a dog with a torch in his mouth, the torch of truth. And they embraced this because there was a medieval pun that called us Dominicans, dogs of the Lord. So Dominic thought, I don't know when this actually began to be used, the dog as a symbol, but ever since then. One of my first experiences in church was when my mom would take me for confession on Saturday. And she'd plunk me down in a pew, and next to me there was this big statue of Our Lady giving the rosary to Catherine of Siena and Dominic. And there was a dog. And I just thought, I'm about 5, and I'm like, what's the dog all about, you know? And little did I know I would become one of the dogs of the Lord. Anyway. So he gets permission for the order, and he will found a house of men in Toulouse. Now what happens is he gets permission, approval for the order from Pope Honorius III, comes back to Toulouse and shocks the men by saying, I want you to leave this house in twos and go out and preach. I want you to go to France. I want you to go to Poland. I want you to go to England. I want you to go to Scotland. It's amazing how quickly the order spread. One of them hesitated and said, I don't want to go unless I have more money. Okay, this is a kind of a failing of ours. Okay, so Dominic gave him more money and said, get out of here, okay, and go. But this is one of our early convents in Fanjeaux, which is outside of Toulouse, one of the first cloisters. Just going to go through a beautiful building here. This is all in. Now this is interesting here. Now, I'm going to explain the soap is to die for in a bit. But Dominic is thinking about founding this monastery for women. And apparently he sees lightning strike right here and says, that's where I'm going to put that convent. And that's called the sign of God, the sign from God about where to begin that. So in this countryside, it looks just pretty much the way Dominic would have seen it. It's very beautiful. The Seigneur is a soap that is made by the Summit Dominican nuns. Okay, and that's the label they give it. So I'm going to do a little advertising for them too. You can order it through their, they have various kinds of different soaps. That's how they make their money. But that's what we call St. Dominic's country in southern France. Stunning. This is a place where Dominic would have preached. It was a kind of a castle town nearby. In Carcassonne. I was surprised. I was there a couple years ago to go into this beautiful medieval church, and there's a sign in there. There's a very serious castle. This castle was never captured, although they surrendered during what was called the Albigensian Crusade. This is going to be the Church of the Jacobins in Toulouse. This would have been a Dominican church. Now it's in it's owned by the state. After the French Revolution, they confiscated a lot of these properties. Fortunately, they didn't tear them down. This is very unusual because it has the pillars going down the middle of the church. They said this was common, although I've never seen another church like this, but they would have a curtain, and the curtain would run from pillar to pillar, and the Dominicans would be on one side praying the office, and the lay people would be on the other side to hear what was going on. And this is this fabulous palm tree vaulting in this church of the Jacobins. Okay, here's St. Thomas's. St. Thomas, of course, is one of our great stars who comes along in the mid-1200s. He's going to be teaching in Naples. He teaches in Paris. And they're getting everywhere by walking. It's amazing how they got around and how international they were. But he would live here. This is where he's buried in Toulouse. Now we're going to fast forward to the United States. I think the fact that we're 800 years old is a real testimony, though, to Dominic's vision of how to put together a new order. I mean, this had not been tried before. You had democracy on a regular basis. Priors are going to be voted in for 3 years. They can be re-elected for 3 more years. Then you have term limits. These are very modern ideas because then for the third election, you need two things. You need the approval of the provincial. Secondly, you need a 2/3 majority instead of one more than 50%, or what do you call that kind of majority? Simple majority. So he built in term limits into right across the board for provincials, for the Master General, et cetera. And here we are still today. And we've never really gone through any kind of a split or a breakaway group in all that time. Now, in the colonial period, the only Dominicans really came from Spain, as far as I'm able to tell, and were mostly restricted south of the current border of the United States, except for a short period of time in Florida. There would have been a few Dominicans there, but either in the Caribbean, in Mexico, the Baja Peninsula, that's where Dominicans would have been and still are today. There were no Dominicans that I am aware of, again, except in Florida, in the territory of the United States until after the Revolutionary War, and especially the Bill of Rights with its insistence on freedom of religion. What is absolutely crucial about the freedom of religion is that while individual states were allowed to continue to have an established religion or an official religion, like Connecticut will hang on to Congregationalism for well into the 1800s. But the entire country was not going to have an established religion. That was going to be the difference. The Anglicans thought that the country should be officially Anglican, as they are in England, but awkwardly without the king as the head of the church. So they had to come up with a new organization called the Episcopal Church. But even if you think about the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., it's called the National Cathedral. Isn't that interesting? And if you go there, they welcome you to your National Cathedral. There was an act of Congress which denotes it as the National Cathedral. And I always tell them, this is not my National Cathedral, okay? This is a very nice building. But anyway, I'm going to keep going here. The president of Yale at the time, so every state would have its official religion. You would have Quakers in Pennsylvania, you had Baptists in Rhode Island, you had Congregationalists in Connecticut and Massachusetts, you had Anglicans in Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. The president of Yale said that the only thing which kept the revolution moving forward was their common hatred of Catholicism. And I find that to be a very interesting statement coming from the president of Yale. But once they fought alongside Catholics and were saved by the Catholic French, that prejudice was no longer tenable. When George Washington learned that the New England soldiers at Valley Forge were going to celebrate Pope Day, which is on November 5th, the same as Guy Fawkes Day in Britain, which is an anti-Catholic feast day, he said there will be no Pope Day, ever. And there never was. Again, it's an amazing thing. When George spoke, everybody bowed. When they wanted to argue about where's the capital of the country going to be, New York or Philadelphia, he said it's going to be outside of Alexandria, Virginia. And they bowed, and it was done. You know, it's amazing. So Catholics are now free to worship, even in Massachusetts, where a priest would have been executed if he had been caught a second time, being in the state. Dominicans begin trickling in, mostly from Ireland, volunteering to serve under Bishop John Carroll and eventually Bishop Fenwick in Boston as missionaries apostolic, not as part of a province. I asked an Irish Dominican about this, and he said, why would they come? And he said they were probably on the wrong side of elections. So either they were former provincials who had become unpopular as a result of decisions they made in Ireland, and then would come over, or they were losing in elections and thought that the best thing to do is to continue my ministry, but somewhere else where the politics are not so intense. We even have a former provincial from England who is working now in California for that very same reason. I asked him, why don't you stay? He said, there's nowhere for me to go in the English province. Simple as that. So now he's happily in the United States. It's funny, I said you become provincial, then everybody hates you, and then you go to the United States. I want to talk about some of these guys first. Bishop Carroll was struggling to establish and staff new parishes, depending heavily on the assistance of foreign-born bishops. At least 9 Dominican priests from the Irish province served under Bishop Carroll in his newly founded Diocese of Baltimore. These could be people who were important to Bishop Carroll as well. They just weren't filling slots. One of them was William Vincent O'Brien. He had been provincial of the Irish province and was appointed to be pastor of St. Peter's Church in New York City, the oldest Catholic church in New York. He served through several yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s and died in 1816. Francis Fleming was another Irish Dominican. He was assigned to St. Mary's in Philadelphia and was named by Bishop Carroll to be his vicar for the diocese's northern district, which included Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and New England. Okay, that was, so he was going to be the acting bishop, if you want, the vicar for that area. There weren't that many Catholics. There were probably 10 Catholics in Massachusetts when the Revolution ended. So there wasn't a lot of visiting that had to be done. But they are going to begin coming in. He defended John Carroll when John Carroll was accused by German Catholics of favoring Jesuits. He died of yellow fever in 1793 when 5,000 people in Philadelphia also died of that epidemic in one summer. Michael Burke came to the United States in 1789 and he was assigned to St. Peter's in New York, dying there in 1800. Two others, I'm going to mention Dominic May and Bartholomew Augustine McMahon, arrived in Philadelphia in 1793 and 1799 respectively and died shortly after, both from yellow fever. We have a long history of yellow fever, which I might get to at the end of this talk. Anthony Caffrey came to the United States in 1794, and he established the first Catholic church in Washington, D.C., St. Patrick's. He became a thorn in Carroll's side because he insisted that all the District of Columbia be in his one parish. So after 10 years of this, Carroll sent him to New York City. 3 years later, Caffrey returned to Ireland and died there in 1811. Some Irish Dominicans came as missionaries apostolic after the province of St. Joseph was established and helped to establish first Catholic churches in Portland, Maine, in Dover, New Hampshire, Exeter, New Hampshire, Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Lawrence, Massachusetts. I tried tracking down these guys to see where they were buried, and I made 2 mistakes. You'd think historians would be a little bit sensible. First mistake is I went up there when there's a foot of snow on the ground. You don't want to go through a cemetery and looking for a grave. Fortunately, they had Celtic crosses where they were, so they had monuments. That saved the day. The second thing was how to find these places. Some of these churches had been closed. Where was the cemetery? What I did was I would drive into a place like Exeter, New Hampshire, and I'd go to a McDonald's. And this is really high-tech historical research. And I would find the oldest couple in the McDonald's, and I'd sit at the table with them and say, "Where's St. Mary's Church and Cemetery?" And inevitably, they knew. And they'd get a little napkin out and a map and tell me exactly where to go. Okay, it would seem that the Irish province, though, instead of allowing its brethren to travel independently to the United States, would consider establishing the order in a more normal way and working with the bishops as a province. But this did not happen. Enter the English. There are 3 men who are instrumental in founding the first province of the Dominicans in the United States. The most important of these 3 was Edward Dominic Fenwick, the guy you saw in the very first slide. He was an American himself, coming from Maryland, and he was the one with the vision to return to the newly independent English colonies, now called the United States of America, not as a missionary under the authority of the Bishop of the United States, but as a member of the Dominican order and an independent province. He was also the one with the money. The second most important person was this man, Luke Concannon, an Irishman and associate to the Vicar General of the Dominican Order in Rome. It was to Concannon, he was the vicar for English speakers, English-speaking provinces. So he writes to Concannon and in 1803, expressing his desire to move quickly to establish this province. Concannon not only encouraged Fenwick in this regard, but he broke several rules in allowing the province to go forward. For one thing, for a province to be founded, you needed something like 30 men to found a province. We had 4. You needed something like how many priories? 3 or 4 priories. We didn't even have a building. Okay, so he's breaking rules, but at the time it's the French Revolution, Europe is a mess. And he's thinking there's actually signs of hope in the United States, so let's just break some rules, make some exceptions, and send them on their way. He also donated his entire library to the new province, which we still have today. And those books were very valuable at the time, as well as $2,000 of his will to the new province. So he really believed in the province. The third person who would prove essential to the new endeavor was Father Thomas Wilson. I just want to spend a little time on him. He became the first bishop of New York, but he never got to New York, because Napoleon blockaded the port of Naples, where he was going to depart from. So he could never get on the ship, and he dies in Naples, and that's where he's buried today. The first bishop of New York is buried in Naples, Italy. But there he is. He's from... And this is where they would have lived. This is where St. Thomas Aquinas lives. This is a very strange-looking church. This is in Naples. This is going to be the church here, and the residences are on either side. Okay, now we're going to come to the 13 colonies. I find it interesting that Vermont and Maine are not colonies. I always thought they were, but they weren't. So this is what we're dealing with in terms of English speakers coming to this now United States. This is going to be the colony of Maryland, which is going to be founded originally as an experiment in religious freedom. The Calverts get permission from King Charles I to found a colony, so they get a charter. They come over and make this Maryland. Now, Virginia's not happy about this because they claim that this is part of Virginia. So there's going to be a little fighting that will take place before things get sorted out. But there's always going to be a lot of tension between Virginia and Maryland. So they land here on an island right here, have Mass, and then they explore the area down here and make the capital St. Mary's City. If you have the chance to go down there, it's quite a ways to get down there, even from Washington. It's well worth it. They're starting to rebuild the city. It was abandoned for a couple of reasons. The tobacco crop failed several years in a row, and the Puritans took over the state. The Puritans were being thrown out of Virginia. So they went to the Lord Baltimore and said, can we come to your colony? We hear you have religious freedom. Sure, 300 of them come. They take over the government. They move the capital to where it is now in Annapolis. Interestingly, I'm not going to talk about St. Mary's City and how it's constructed yet anyway. I'm going to keep going. This is how they came over, okay? This is the cargo ship. This is a replica, so it's the exact size of the original. It would have been manned by probably 4 or 5 sailors, and that would have brought their supplies with them. There was a passenger ship that was about 3 times bigger than this, and it would have been brought over. 10% of the population was Catholic. It wasn't like this was a Catholic colony. It was only 10%. And they brought over 3 Jesuits with them, too, in rather dramatic fashion. And so those Jesuit missions are going to be very important, but we'll let a Jesuit tell you about those. Let's see, what else do I want to do here? See, what they're doing at St. Mary's now is they're doing a lot of excavation. The place was really nothing but a fallow field until they started realizing that there was a city here, and the city had a plan. They discovered the bodies of the Calverts in the ground and realized that this was the basement of the church. So since then, they have, back in 1980, there was almost nothing of this town that was standing. They had rebuilt the governor's house, and that was it. But now they've rebuilt the Catholic Church, and they realized that what Calvert did when he constructed the city, he put the Catholic Church at one end, a mile away from the residences and the stores. Put the governor's house a mile away on the other side, emphasizing the separation of church and state. Okay? What did the Puritans do when they moved it to Annapolis? They have a place called the Governor's Circle, where the governor's house is. The next block over, the church circle. Okay? They don't see that separation of church and state, or certainly didn't at the time. So Fenwick is huge. Let's gonna keep going. Fenwick will, so there's a little bit of the backstory here. The English have a college in Bornem, Belgium, because they're thrown out of England in the by Henry VIII. So their houses are confiscated, their property is gone, they're not allowed to exist as a religious order, so a lot of them moved to France or Belgium and set up colleges there. Those buildings are still standing. But let me see, I'm just going to go back a little bit. What happens in 1800 is that Napoleon will move north and take over this part of Europe. The English Dominicans flee to England. They leave Fenwick behind, thinking he's an American. Napoleon will certainly have some kind of sympathy for an American, and maybe he'll be able to save the buildings. Not so. Napoleon has him arrested for a period of time. Finally, he's released and allowed to go back to England. So the English have no college anymore. So this is part of the motivation for Fenwick to start something in the United States. Okay. In 1803, so Fenwick's going to be in England now for 10 more years, and somebody in England told me it must have been 10 very boring years. The English province in 1803 was struggling to survive. It consisted of a few missionaries, no real priories, and no schools. In 1822, the provincial, whose name was John Ambrose Woods, stated that there were only 14 men in the English province, that 6 of them were over 60 years old, all of whom would be dead by 1830, and that only 3 of them were under 48 years of age, one of whom would leave the order, and another would die in 1831. So they're desperate to keep everybody together. And kind of little does he realize that this young American is working to undo this. Younger members of the province like Fenwick and Wilson, who I'll talk about, who was the president of Bornem College, wanted a return to the wearing of the habit and community life. And this was resisted by the older members who had been serving in England and had grown accustomed to living on their own and being left alone. One proposal was simply to abolish the English province. This was narrowly voted down. The province's numbers would continue to dwindle until 1850, when we find only 7 Dominicans left in England. The order in general was not in good shape. Emperor Joseph II in Austria had suppressed several convents in Austria, Hungary in the mid-1700s, and this spirit carried over to France and the French Revolution, which saw the order completely ruined and its buildings and land confiscated. It would not be reestablished in France until 1850 under Lacordaire. Secularization movements also began in Spain and Portugal, which saw the order suppressed in both countries in 1834. And also in their North American colonies in South America and the Central America. In Italy, the order was suppressed in 1870. Fenwick could not know any of this, of course, except the expulsion of the order from France and its uncertain future in England. Impatient at the impasse, he wrote to Concannon in 1803 that he was considering founding a vicariate of the order in the United States. Not a province, but a vicariate. Now, vicariates are dependent on a mother province for money and manpower until they are able to establish their own independence as a province. Initially, Concannon had Fenwick communicate with him through the older brother of the provincial in England, thinking that the provincial should be in on the discussions and possibly be of some help in supplying men for the American province. Also not so. The provincial was Thomas Anthony Plunkett. He was having none of this, and he resisted the project from the start, trying desperately to hold his province together. He did not want to lose his youngest and most promising priests, as simple as that. The penal laws against Catholics, though somewhat relaxed, would be in effect in England until 1829, and would not permit Catholics to vote or hold office, or the order to build a priory. Fenwick, seeing a now free United States, thought the penal laws against Catholics having been lifted there with independence, saw an opportunity for the order to grow and not just survive. It's clear from his letters to Concannon that Fenwick was proposing establishing the order in the United States and not just going as a missionary, which his uncle actually did. His uncle Ceslaus went to the Jesuit missions in Maryland to help out and is buried in a Jesuit cemetery. He never joined the order either. But this Fenwick wants to start something which is going to be a much more organized, official part of the order. He cites the need for more priests in the U.S. and his own temporal means, his inheritance. About 10 or 1,200 acres was owed to him by his family. Some small houses, a proportionate share of Negro slaves, livestock, and a certain capital in the American funds. And he stressed these as urgent matters to Concannon. He said his health was fragile, the possibility of his dying soon and losing the inheritance to his brother was very real. Instead, the order was, if it was to be established, it should be established soon, and he would make use of these funds on behalf of the Dominicans. Now, the Jesuits had been the only religious order in the American colonies up to the American Revolution and had most of their influence in the colony of Maryland. The Fenwicks, whose home was in Maryland, would have known them. But the Jesuits had been suppressed as an order in 1773 due to the machinations of the kings of Spain and France and the Earl of Pombal in Portugal, who thought the Jesuits were overly powerful, both financially and in the sphere of education, and meddling in the work of the colonies. Jesuit missionaries famously, if you watch the movie The Mission, which is really based on what happened between Brazil and between the Portuguese and the Spanish in Brazil. They're going to oppose the slave trading that went on there in that part of the world. So these countries are anxious to get rid of them. This explains why Edward Dominic's uncle, Ceslaus, in wanting to join a religious order, would have looked elsewhere. So John Fenwick joined the English Dominican province and went to Louvain in Belgium to study, was ordained in 1785, and moved to nearby Bornum to teach at the English Dominican College there. Once the American Revolutionary War was over and the seas were safe to travel, Edward, at the age of 16, entered Bornum College in Belgium in 1784. In 1790, he makes solemn vows as a Dominican, and he was the first person in history to sign his name as an American. And I think I might actually see, it's right here. His handwriting is pretty bad. Edward Dominic Fenwick, Americanus. So we have his signature here, Edward Fenwick. Okay, and this is how they're going to, now what happens next is, I think, very interesting. In another important letter to Concannon, he specifies which brothers would be helpful in this endeavor. Father Keistrick, a French Dominican, now affiliated with the English province, Father Storder and Meerts of the Flemish province. But above all, he said the most important man was Thomas Wilson, the rector of Bornum. His talents and zeal, I think, would ensure me success, and a word directly from the Master General or you would be cheerfully obeyed by him. Would you then, dear sir, signify to him directly your and the Vicar General's wish that he should join me for America? It will be more decisive and satisfactory to him than to hear it only from me, though I shall now inform him now how much it is my wish to have him. Fenwick also asked for money, either from the English province, which he was not going to get, or from the generalate in Rome, or both, in order to pay for transporting the men to America. Passage which cost 60 pounds apiece, and Fenwick only had 100 pounds in England, though he was confident he could get more. In another letter, Concannon Fenwick worries that the English provincial will not approve the withdrawal of any priests for America unless he gets a direct order from the master in Rome. In the meantime, Fathers Wilson and another Angers, another prof at Bornum, told Fenwick of their desire to accompany him. Bornum had been reestablished as a result of the Concordat between Napoleon and the Pope in 1801, but was on shaky ground as there were few students in Europe's uncertain environment. In 1804, Napoleon again invades Belgium and nationalizes the church property again. Other than Wilson, Fenwick was desperate for a few others to come, but what he got was a mixed bag that would prove to be a source of trouble to come in America. Angers seems to have been a problem in Bornum. Wilson did not like him. Wilson, while president, had written to the provincial in 1802 asking for a procurator, which is a financial manager, suggesting James Vincent Sharp or Joseph Smith, with the warning about Smith, if ever he come over again, he may not be as intimate with Father Angers as he was before. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. Adding, Father Angers would gladly be procurator, but would then, I fear, be insupportable and refuse to do what little he does. Okay, so there's a lot of hidden messages in those things. But Fenwick was desperate for bodies, and Angers would accompany him to the United States. But Fenwick had the sense to keep Angers and Wilson apart. Even though there's only 4 guys going to go, let's keep them away from each other. So Angers will stay in Maryland for 2 years at the behest of the bishop and would be assigned to parishes in Kentucky finally in 1807, far away from Wilson and St. Rose Priory. So now I have to look and see. This is how they're going to go. Fenwick gets the shock of his life when he comes to the United States finally, because he meets with Bishop Carroll. Now, all along they've been talking about establishing the order, establishing a college, and Carroll tells him, you know what? I don't want you to establish a college in Maryland. There's already a college here, and we'll just be competing with each other. That college's name? Georgetown. Okay. He said, you know what's happening, though, is there is a huge migration of people going out west due to a number of things from Maryland, the failure of the tobacco crop, and also the deal made with Revolutionary War soldiers for free land. If you just go out there, stake your claim, et cetera, et cetera. And they knew that the land out in Kentucky and Tennessee was very fertile ground, and that their farms could survive, but in another part of the world. In a 10-year period, I think it's between around 1795 and 1805, 300,000 people went through the Cumberland Gap. And I asked a ranger there, I said, what was here in 1805, which is when our man went through? He said nothing was here. There were a couple forts, and there may have been a couple of farms, but he said when you came out here, you had to bring everything. There were no stores, there were no hotels, nothing. You brought everything with you, extra animals, your feed, your seeds for planting, et cetera, your building materials, and all that kind of thing. So he's going to travel down, and this is the way you would go. You would go down there, there's a road, there's a military road that goes down through the Cumberland Gap and through the Shenandoah Valley, and then you're going to go across this little blurry, so then you're going to come through the Cumberland Gap here, and you're going to head up north toward Louisville, although they're going to stop short of Louisville in the area of Bardstown. I have some actual photographs of people going. So this is what the road looks like today. I went there and he said, go down to the road. He said, it's not a reproduction, it's the real road. He said, your men would have come along that road. And actually the 2 of them, their carriage spilled, and one guy broke his arm and the other guy got a big gash in his head.
Go out that door, take a left, and just follow.
There you go. There's the actual photograph of Daniel Boone. Now, the thing that's interesting to me is here you have this very sophisticated
Got a good shot, right?
Fenwick, who comes from a wealthy family in Maryland. He's used to living in Belgium, civilization. He's living in England, civilization. He goes from the King of England to Daniel Boone. And I just find that to be, he's amazing in his adaptability. For somebody to do that, it's an amazing commitment to spreading the faith. And this is where we're going to end up. These are kind of primitive maps. But this is an area, Bardstown it became the diocese. But you can see it was called New Rome, or Little Rome. All these names, St. Catherine, St. Rose, St. Thomas College, St. Mary's, Loretto, the Trappists are here in Gethsemane, Holy Cross. and on and on. It's really an amazing concentration. In fact, the building we bought first, Fenwick bought one, a brick building, which was very unusual at the time, from a Protestant, because he was anxious to get out of the area, because there were so many Catholics moving in. So we okay. This is what he's going to, from, you know, again, from England to this kind of thing, typical cabins. This is St. Rose. Now, he's going to end up in St. Rose in Kentucky, along Cartwright Creek. And this is a picture that was taken around 1900, I would say, and it looks exactly the same today. It's wonderful, beautiful farmland. Jefferson Davis went to that college for 1 year. He was 10 years old. And he talked about, he got caught. They had a food fight. Things never change. They had a food fight, and he got caught. And so Wilson is the president now of this college that they set up in St. Rose. He calls Jefferson Davis in and he says, I'm going to tell you something. I'm not going to punish you, but you have to tell me what you did. He said, I turned out the lights. It must have been quite a food fight, you know. But anyway, he said he was true to his word. He never punished me for that. But he says, I was always a little bit careful about hanging around with the older boys because they could get us into trouble. He was also very grateful to the Dominicans forever. He sent all his kids to Dominican schools, even though he was not Catholic. He never became Catholic. But he really liked the Dominicans, the sisters in Memphis, etc. This is what the guys would do. We would use this as a division or a college student tape for a while, but they would work on the farm. Okay, now we're going to get into the next thing that develops in our province is kind of unexpected in that you have these Englishmen coming over and the Americans. So there's 4 of them now. They're working in the area of Kentucky. What you begin finding is that people coming from Mediterranean countries want to help us out and be part of our province. So you get names that are either Italian or Spanish. So you get James Orengo is founding a lot of parishes. And if you go to Kentucky today, in Tennessee, you'll find his name on plaques all over the place that he founded this. So he was kind of like a traveling missionary, rather loosely connected to the province. I don't think that my man, Father Kelly, who became provincial, likes him very much. Kelly had a diary, and he does mention something about the troublesome or independent Father Orengo. They're very kind of, there are hints that there was tension between Orengo, who was a pretty free spirit. But you also have names like Matsu Kelly, Cubero, Alamani, okay? And then all of a sudden, something happens. So these are going to be, Matsu Kelly is another guy who's going to be very independent. He's going to go north up into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He's going to be in the area of Minnesota, and he's going to be translating things into the Winnebago language. I mean, he's an amazing person as well, and there's some debate about what was his affiliation with our province. One historian thought he was a terrible Dominican, that he was not affiliated with the province at all, and basically used the province for his own benefit. Another archivist wrote that he was actually a pretty good Dominican, that, you know, circumstances were such that you had to be independent, okay? You didn't have a huge organization and go from priory to priory. The fact is that there was some question about what he was doing in Iowa, I believe it was. And the provincial called him to Ohio and says, I want to ask you a few questions about what's going on. And he came, which means to me that he had a certain sense of obedience to his provincial. And so therefore some connection to us as a province. Matsu Kelly tries to attract his own relatives to come and help him out as missionaries. And they leave, they come, they see the wilderness, and they're like, I said there was no Trevi fountain in Iowa. They sit around and sip cappuccino. So they all went back to Italy. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for the Mediterranean missionaries. And then what's happening is the Irish begin coming in the 1840s. And the Irish who are already here realize that we cannot stay stuck out in farm country in Kentucky or Ohio, where our second house was founded. And so the church burns down in Somerset.
The prior writes to the provincial and says, if you rebuild this church, you are crazy. Because this is our big chance to get out of here and to move to the East Coast, where all these Irish are pouring in. Well, they begin, their machinations are amazing, because what the Irish are going to do, they're going to be asked by, there's Whalen, who's the Bishop of Nashville. We lost a lot of our good men because they were made bishops. So a lot of our natural leadership, where they were made Bishop of St. Paul, Minnesota, they were made Bishop of Nashville, et cetera, et cetera. Then we're going to move to Ohio, into this area here, which is still farmland. It's still Appalachia. There's our first church there, house in Somerset, convent in Somerset. They would have done the same thing in Somerset. We had a college there. These are the nuns that are going to be begun. They're actually begun in St. Rose. Wilson gets up and he says, I need young women who are going to help us teach the youth. And 4 women come forward, and thus the first really order or congregation of Dominican sisters begins. I believe before the Sisters of Charity, who there's a display that says they were started in 1810. I think we beat them by a couple of years, but this is an early photograph of them from Columbus, right? They're going to, so they're going to start, they're going to move up to, from Springfield, Kentucky, they will move up, from St. Catharines, Kentucky, they move up to Somerset, and they found another congregation up there, eventually in Columbus, Ohio, and then in 1860 they will move down to Nashville, where they still are today and thriving. This is a kind of house that Fenwick actually said Mass in this house in 1817. What blew my mind about this is I get there, I'm holding Fenwick's missionary book. So when he would go on his missionary rounds, he would take a book with him and record baptisms, first communions, marriages, et cetera, et cetera. And I found out from a missionary, he says, I think that book is in the office in Somerset. And this was 15 years ago. I said, you gotta be kidding me. He says, I remember seeing it there. So I drove out to Somerset, Ohio. I go to the office, there it is. I said, what's this? I get the bag out, my white gloves, put it in the bag. I said, this is going to the archives, okay? So I'm on my way back. I stopped to see this church where he said Mass, and I'm carrying that book with me. And I'm thinking, this blows a historian's mind. Fenwick had this book with him when he said Mass. I said, that's amazing. To a historian, it doesn't get too much better than that. Okay, and this is what this is. These are scenes from Somerset in around 1900. This is St. Joe's. The church is still standing. They did rebuild it, and it's still there, but they torn down the convent. Okay, baseball, interesting. We have a diary from a pastor in Memphis. Diary from a pastor in Memphis who says they're playing a new game in 1876. He said it's a parish picnic to raise money for the orphanage in Memphis. He said they're playing a new game, it's called baseball. He said, I don't think it's going to last very long. This is the provincial and the prior. This is a development that happened. The first thing I want to talk about is that the Irish are going to try in a very kind of shifty way to get parishes on the East Coast. They get bishops to invite them to start a parish in Washington, D.C. This is a huge moment for us. It's called St. Dominic's, and it's still there today. So they write to the master, who's against parishes. He wants us to have colleges and large houses, not parishes. We don't want to get bogged down with parishes. They write to him and say, you'll be very glad to know that the Bishop of Baltimore has invited us to take over St. Dominic's Church in Washington, and it's thriving. Well, of course they knew he was not happy at all about it, and he wrote back to them and he said, if you do this ever again, he says, I'm going to come over and shut down that province. I mean, he was so angry. So then about 2 years later, they wrote back and said, you'll be very glad to know that the Bishop of New York has invited us to start a parish in Manhattan. And of course, he's steaming about this. And he sends a visitor, and the visitor writes back and says, this is the stupidest idea anybody's ever had, having these parishes. But the parishes then will start springing up and, all over the place. So much so that we have now about, 13 parishes. I would say we've closed a few down. We opened We had 20 at one point. And those parishes are going to serve as vocations are going to come out of those parishes and those parish schools. And that's where the province is really going to grow. Now, another thing, the one provincial is also against parishes, and they seem to spring up even despite him. But he's going to come up with the idea of forming mission bands. And these mission bands would go to a parish just like they do today. There'd be about 4 or 5 of them. They would preach. One guy was the star. The other guys were like apprentices, but they would help with confessions and communions. This really helped to build up the order because this made a lot of money for the province. And so by the time we get to 1900, and these this is what they did full time. They went from parish to parish, and not just our parishes, but they would be invited by parishes in the diocese in New York or wherever. Now that's in the Northwest. That would be like Minnesota, is what they were talking about there. Here's another group. I call them the Grim Bearers of the Glad Tidings. But you can see that the order is not English anymore, and it's not Mediterranean anymore. This is 1914 in Louisville, Kentucky. You have Fathers Crowley, Cahill, Lyons, and Baxter, all Irish names. And that's the way it's going to be up until the 1970s, I would say. This gets me into another topic, and I don't think I want to go there because I think I'm going to run out of time. So I think I'll wrap it up with that.